A cattle driver named Elijah Briggs walked into a saloon one night in the winter of 1881 and was never seen again. He was last spotted stumbling up the creaking wooden steps of a boarding house attached to a tavern run by two sisters. Their names were whispered, never written. To this day, no record of their births, no graves, and no family lineage has ever been verified. The only surviving trace of their existence comes in fragments: sheriff's reports buried in courthouse basements, torn diary pages, and local folklore carved into the fading timber of the old town. They called it the Silver Veil Tavern, a place where weary miners, gamblers, and drifters sought beer, warmth, and women in the barren frontier nights of Colorado. But those who entered often never left. What began as a rumor, men vanishing after drinking too much, soon hardened into something darker. Horses left tethered outside the saloon for days. Wives searching for husbands who had sworn they'd return. And an undertone of dread that crept into the bones of every man who dared sit in that smoky, candle-lit room. In the Wild West, men died every day, shot, knifed, or dragged beneath wagons. But here in this tavern the deaths were different. They weren't loud, they weren't public, they were silent and hidden. The sisters smiled, poured another drink, and the floorboards seemed to echo with something deeper than footsteps. Something like a heartbeat. This is not just the story of a tavern, it is the story of a ritual. A family secret buried beneath the myth of the American frontier, and a reminder that the Wild West was not simply built on blood, it was built on sacrifice. The town was called Ash Hollow. Today, you will not find it on any map. What remains of it is little more than warped foundations, skeletal chimneys, and a graveyard with stones so weathered their names have vanished. But in 1881, Ash Hollow was alive, thriving on silver ore and the fever, dream promises of the frontier. Railroad men, lawless drifters, and fortune seekers poured through, their hunger for wealth met with whiskey and violence. The Silver Veil Tavern stood at the center of it all, its lanterns glowing like a beacon in the night. The sisters welcomed them in with smiles that were remembered as both tender and terrifying. Everyone in town knew that Ash Hollow had a secret, though few dared to speak it aloud. The sheriff looked the other way. The church bells rang, but their hollow tones seemed to drown beneath the music and laughter leaking from the tavern's warped doors. Children whispered about shadows at the tavern windows, faces watching even when no one was inside. Women passed by its wooden steps quickly, clutching their shawls tighter, avoiding the stares of the sisters whose eyes never seemed to blink. What happened inside the Silver Veil was not entirely human. Men spoke of feeling drowsy after just a single drink, their vision swimming before they collapsed in the upstairs rooms. And if they awoke, they often described something, hands pressed against their chest. A low humming, almost like a prayer, spoken in voices that did not belong to any church. Ash Hollow tried to forget, but the ground beneath it never did. Who were they? Some called them Evelyn and Clara. Others swore their names were foreign, unpronounceable, carried from another land, another time. The truth is uncertain. No census records, no birth certificates, no graves, only scattered testimony from the living who barely escaped. The sisters were described as beautiful, but in a way that unsettled. Not the beauty of roses or spring, but the beauty of something too still, like a porcelain doll or a wax figure in a carnival tent. They dressed in black even when mourning was not required, their hair pinned high, their lips painted with a strange dark stain no one could identify. They claimed their tavern was respectable, a place of rest for lonely travelers. But their kindness carried weight. Men spoke of their hands lingering too long when pouring a drink, of their eyes watching them as though measuring something inside their soul. The upstairs rooms were never rented to women. Only men, and when a man went missing, the sisters smiled the same way, as if they knew something the rest of the town could never understand. Some claimed the sisters were widows collecting grief like coins. Others believed they were witches, their tavern a disguise for something ritualistic. But the strongest rumor was whispered by the children of Ash Hollow, that the sisters had no reflections, that when a mirror was carried into the tavern, the glass cracked, and no one dared bring another. The first official disappearance wasn't Elijah Briggs, that was just the one remembered most clearly. In truth, there had been 5 before him. In September of 1880, a group of miners entered the Silver Veil after weeks in the mountains. They drank heavily, boasting of striking a new vein of silver. By morning, not one of them remained. Their belongings, picks, hats, boots, were still piled neatly by the door, their horses still tethered outside. But the men themselves were gone. The sheriff claimed they had skipped town. Others said they had been robbed, but the town's wives whispered a different story. They spoke of faint screams in the night, cut short, echoing from the tavern walls. They spoke of the sisters walking the streets the next morning in fresh dresses, their hands clean, their faces glowing as though something inside them had been fed. The graves of Ash Hollow multiplied, but many had no bodies. Empty plots filled the churchyard, stones marking names but not corpses. The preacher warned of sin, but his own sermons grew nervous, stuttering, as though he feared the sisters were listening. By winter, 10 men had vanished. By spring 15, Ash Hollow did not call it murder, they called it fate. For in the frontier, death was a language everyone spoke. But behind closed doors, mothers told their sons, "Do not step inside the Silver Veil. For those who enter do not come back out the same, if they come back at all." In 1881, whispers turned to terror. Survivors began to speak, quietly, shamefully. A gambler named Reuben Hayes staggered out of the Silver Veil one dawn, his shirt torn, his chest marked with strange burns. He claimed he had awoken upstairs, surrounded by candles, the sisters chanting in low voices he did not recognize. A basin of water sat beside the bed, stained red. Hayes swore they had pressed something against his chest, a brand or perhaps a hand so hot it scorched flesh. He said he felt his heartbeat falter as though someone else was inside him, pulling it away. Most called him a drunk, but those who saw the scars on his body did not laugh. Soon talk of ritual spread through Ash Hollow. The Sisters' Tavern was said to have a cellar, a place no one was allowed to enter. Some swore they heard movement beneath the floorboards at night. Others claimed to smell iron and salt leaking through the cracks, even when no food was cooking. By mid-summer, the town was divided. Some men still drank there, drawn by the sisters' beauty, their intoxicating smiles. Others crossed the street when passing the tavern, their hats pulled low, their eyes averted. And in the churchyard, more graves appear. Empty as before, the Silver Veil Tavern no longer felt like a place of rest. It felt like a mouth, always open, always hungry. Sheriff Thomas Grady was no stranger to violence. He had buried friends after gunfights, pulled bodies from mines, and seen enough blood to fill a river. Yet when it came to the Silver Veil, he did nothing. Every report of a missing man ended the same way: no foul play suspected, case closed. His handwriting in the ledgers was rushed, shaky, as if he wished to be rid of the duty as quickly as possible. Some said he was paid off, others claimed he was afraid, terrified not of the sisters, but of whatever he believed stood behind them. There are stories of the sheriff being seen outside the tavern late at night, standing still in the snow, his face pale, his hat in his hands as though he were paying respects at a funeral. One miner swore he saw Grady enter the tavern after midnight and emerge at dawn, stumbling like a man drained of life. His badge was missing from his chest. When asked, the sheriff only muttered, "Best not to look too close, best not to ask." Authority had vanished from Ash Hollow. The law was not just blind here, it was gagged, bound, and left to rot. The preacher of Ash Hollow, Reverend Samuel Pike, was a frail man with a voice too soft for the rough-hewn pews of his church. But one Sunday in October 1881, his sermon shook the congregation to its core. He warned of false daughters of Eve, who fed upon the weakness of men. He spoke of rituals dressed as hospitality, of taverns that were not places of rest but gates, gateways to something older than the land itself. His hands trembled as he clutched the pulpit, his eyes darting toward the tavern as if he could see it even through the wooden walls of the church. That night his house caught fire, his body was never found. The church bells rang once more, and then fell silent forever. From that day forward, no one dared preach in Ash Hollow. The town had no prayers left. The Silver Veil's cellar was spoken of only in whispers. The sisters never allowed anyone near it, and the trapdoor behind the bar remained locked at all times. But on certain nights, When the wind cut through the town like a knife, townsfolk swore they heard noises beneath the floorboards. Not the scurrying of rats, not the shifting of barrels, but moaning, pleading, voices that should have belonged to men long gone. A boy named Caleb, no older than 12, snuck into the tavern one night when it was closed. He swore he saw the sisters descend into the cellar with candles. Their faces were lit from below, their shadows stretched across the walls in shapes far too tall, far too thin to be human. He ran before he could see more. But weeks later, Caleb disappeared. His mother wailed outside the tavern doors until her voice broke. The sisters stood at the windows watching, silent as stone. What exactly happened in the Silver Veil's cellar remains a matter of speculation, but fragments survive. A drifter named Morgan Calloway stumbled out of town in 1082, half dead and raving. He claimed the sisters had tied him to a chair in the cellar, surrounding him with bowls of silver dust. His wrists were cut, not deeply enough to kill, but enough to bleed into the silver. The sisters sang in unison, their voices never breaking, their eyes never blinking. They dipped their hands into the blood, silver mixture, and smeared it across the cellar walls. Calloway said he felt his body grow weak, as if something invisible was pulling his life away, feeding it into the earth. When he woke, he was alone. The bowls were empty. The sisters were gone. Calloway staggered from Ash Hollow and was found weeks later by a rancher 40 miles away. His story was dismissed as madness. But the scars on his wrists were real, and so was the fear in his eyes when he whispered, "It wasn't them, they were serving someone else." By 1883, Ash Hollow's children no longer played near the tavern. Yet they carried a rhyme on their tongues, one that spread from the dusty alleys to the schoolhouse, sung in shaky voices like a warning wrapped in song. Two sisters in black, pouring beer in a glass, smile when you enter, you will never pass. One takes your breath, the other your skin, and the silver veil swallows what lies within. The rhyme outlived the town. It appeared in diaries of settlers who claimed to have heard it whispered in other camps, far from Colorado. Some said the rhyme traveled like a sickness, attaching itself to wherever the sisters went next, because by 1884, the tavern was empty, the sisters were gone. Ash Hollow itself withered soon after, abandoned to dust and silence. But the rhyme remained, passed down, repeated, reshaped, a memory too dark to die. Decades after Ash Hollow vanished from maps, a box of records surfaced in the basement of the Fremont County Courthouse. The papers were water-damaged, edges eaten by mold, but the handwriting was clear. Inside were reports signed by Sheriff Thomas Grady, pages he had sworn never existed. They detailed names, dates, and disappearances linked to the Silver Veil Tavern. In one file, Grady scribbled a single line that stood apart from his usual dismissals. They asked me to protect the town, but the town was already theirs. Next to the files lay something else, small glass vials filled with a grayish powder. A later chemist identified it as pulverized silver mixed with traces of dried blood. The courthouse clerk who found the box refused to keep it on site. She claimed she felt watched when she opened it, as though the sisters themselves leaned over her shoulder. Within weeks, she quit her post and vanished without notice. The box disappeared soon after. In 1937, a Denver historian named Ruth Wexler began researching Colorado ghost towns. Ash Hollow was meant to be a footnote in her work. Instead, it consumed her. She interviewed descendants of miners who once lived there. Many broke into tears the moment she mentioned the tavern. One elderly woman muttered, "It was never about drink. It was never about money. It was about feeding the ground." Ruth discovered the children's rhyme, still remembered by those who had never even seen Ash Hollow. She traced similar verses to Kansas, Wyoming, and New Mexico, always near towns where saloons had once stood, run by two sisters. In her private notes, she wrote, "If these stories are true, then the sisters were not bound to Ash Hollow. They were moving, they were harvesting." Weeks later, Ruth disappeared from her Denver boarding house. Her manuscript was left unfinished. Her typewriter ribbon stopped mid-sentence. By 1884, Ash Hollow was a ghost. Families fled, the mines collapsed, and the Silver Veil stood alone against the wind. One final newspaper article from a nearby county made mention of the town's last days. Reports claim the sisters boarded a wagon one night and rode eastward. They carried no luggage. The tavern was locked from the inside, yet the windows glowed with light until dawn. When townsfolk broke doors, nothing remained. No chairs, no bottles, no beds. Only walls stained dark, as though the wood itself had been bleeding. By spring, the buildings collapsed. The graveyard stones cracked. Ash Hollow was erased, not by time, but by something deliberate, as though the town itself wished to be forgotten. Modern maps place a reservoir over the site. Divers claim to have found foundations beneath the water, but the state denies excavation requests. The records remain sealed. The Catholic Church, too, had records. In 1892, a priest named Father Miguel Aranda filed a report to his diocese describing women of unnatural nature in Colorado mining towns. His writings were careful, coded. He described them not as witches, but as hosts of a hunger that predates Eden. His report was stamped, catalogued, and locked in the Vatican's archives, but a copy survived, hidden in the private collection of a New Mexico parish. Aranda claimed the sisters' rituals echoed early heretical practices condemned in the 4th century rites where blood was mingled with precious metals and offered to the earth itself. The aim was never money or power. It was to feed something older, something beneath. Soon after writing the report, Father Aranda was found drowned in a dry well. The last known survivor of the Silver Veil was interviewed in 1902. His name was Thomas Ellery, once a deputy in Ash Hollow. He was 64 years old when a young reporter found him in a Denver poorhouse, coughing blood into a rag. Ellery whispered his story, his voice shaking. He said the sisters never aged, never tired. He claimed to have seen them cut open a man in the cellar and pour his blood into a silver chalice. He swore he heard something breathe beneath the dirt floor, something that shook the walls without ever rising to the surface. The reporter asked why no one stopped them. Ellery smiled, toothless, and replied, "Because they weren't killing us. They were keeping it asleep." The next day, Ellery was dead. The reporter's notes vanished from the newspaper's archives. In 1919, the U.S. Bureau of Mines conducted a survey around the old Ash Hollow grounds before the reservoir was built. The report was stamped confidential. Most of it was technical, detailing soil and mineral content. But buried in an appendix was something else, testimony from workers who broke open the tavern's cellar. They described a chamber carved deep into the earth, lined with silver filings pressed into the walls like mortar. Symbols were etched into the wood beams, spirals, circles, and markings no scholar could identify. In the center was a hollow pit, still damp with a substance that shimmered like liquid metal. One worker swore he heard a pulse inside it, faint but steady, as though the ground itself had a heartbeat. That section of the report was blacked out in later copies. The original went missing. Only fragments remain, whispered through the families of men who never again worked the mines. As researchers dug into forgotten archives, a disturbing pattern emerged. Wherever the sisters were rumored to appear, towns followed the same cycle: prosperity, then vanishings, then collapse. A saloon in Wyoming burned down in 1891. The barkeeps described as two pale sisters dressed in black. In Kansas, 1897, a mining camp recorded 20 missing men within 6 months. Witnesses swore they were last seen entering a tavern run by women with unnatural calm. By the early 1900s, similar disappearances surfaced in Oklahoma, Texas, and Arizona. Each time, no bodies, no trials, no explanations, only whispers. The frontier was vast, but the hunger followed. Always two sisters, always a cellar, always the silence of men who knew better than to question. In the 1950s, a handful of folklorists attempted to publish articles on the Ash Hollow sisters. Each was met with ridicule. University boards dismissed the stories as moral panic, the invention of Puritan guilt projected onto the lawlessness of the Wild West. But among their private letters, preserved in dusty university boxes, darker tones emerge. One professor confessed he had visited the reservoir where Ash Hollow once stood. He described the water as unnaturally still, even in storms. He claimed he dreamed of women standing beneath the surface, their eyes open, their mouths moving as though singing to him. He never published again. His students said he grew paranoid, barricading his office door and burning his notes. He died of a sudden stroke at 48. Denial is the language of institutions, but silence is the language of fear. Today, Ash Hollow lies drowned beneath Stillwater Reservoir. Families picnic on its banks, unaware of what lies beneath. Fishermen swear the lake has no sound. No frogs, no crickets, no birds near the waterline, only wind, only silence. Local teenagers dare each other to swim across, but some speak of feeling hands tug at their ankles, pulling them deeper. A diver in the 1970s reported finding timber foundations intact on the lake bed. When he returned to mark the site, he swore it had vanished, replaced by smooth, untouched mud. The water hides what the earth could not contain. And some believe it still feeds. Each year, a handful of drownings are reported at Stillwater. The bodies are never recovered. The current excuse is always the same: the reservoir is too deep. But those who remember the rhyme of Ash Hollow know better. History records the Wild West as a land of lawmen and outlaws, of railroads and silver veins. But buried beneath that narrative is another truth, that some places were not built for men to conquer. They were built to conceal. The sisters of the Silver Veil remain nameless, ageless, untraceable. Their tavern has rotted, their town erased, their story dismissed, and yet their shadow lingers in children's rhymes, in sealed files. In waters where no fish swim, every culture has its sacrifices, its rituals, its secrets meant to keep something older asleep beneath the soil. But the American frontier was not empty land, it was a wound. And the sisters were its caretakers. When you raise a glass in a dark tavern, when the lights flicker and the floorboards creak, when you feel eyes on you though no one is there, remember Ash Hollow, because some doors never close, some mouths never stop feeding, and some sisters are still serving.